All right, so moving right along here, we're going to move on to the playwright Aristophanes, who, unlike Sophocles and Aeschylus, wrote comedies rather than tragedies. And so hopefully you had a good laugh while reading this play. And I think just all these ladies on stage here, with their signs, especially the last one, we prefer men out of uniform, it really cracks me up. So I do want to mention that this play has some, inappropriate content. I mean, I put a disclaimer in the reading questions announcement that I called it R-rated content, profanity and sexuality, not really violence. And now it's really funny because we have like these great literary works that are like masterpieces. In fact, this class used to be called Masterpieces of the Western World before we changed the title of it to Western Lit 1. And so to think of these masterpieces of lit, and this, reading this feels like you're in the middle of like a Seth Rogen comedy or something, with all of the profanity and sexuality. And so I know a lot of you, that might not be content you really feel appropriate reading or studying. And it also might not be appropriate with your parents. I know some students who are still in high school take this class. And so I certainly would not force anyone to read this. And the reason I put it on the syllabus is it's the only comedy in our textbook. And I really wanted us to have a comedy. So maybe in the future, I'll try to track one down. Frogs or something, one of the ones the textbook mentions that's not in there that has less R-rated content. I don't know if they do or not. But that's all to say, if you did not see the reading questions and you have not read this play, but you're watching this lecture now and you're like, oh, wait, R-rated content, pause it, email me, as the reading questions announcement says, I can offer you an alternative assignment. So please contact me about that if you don't want to proceed. But with that said, for those of you who have read this or are ready to rock and roll despite the content, here we go. So recall, we've read 3 tragedies. Take some notes to have in the back of your mind during the lecture of what are the elements of tragedy. Because there's certain things that only show up in tragedies. Like at the end of a comedy, not everyone dies at the end, but there might be other elements, especially, formula elements that might show up in other plays. For instance, the use of the chorus would be an example. So what are the things in tragedy? Kind of jot those down, and then maybe highlight or something. What are the ones you think could show up in comedy or that you saw in this play? And so based on what you know about comedy in general, what are some ways that you think Lysistrata might be different from the tragedies we have read? So if you think, like I said, this feels more like a Seth Rogen movie than it does remind me of Oedipus, Antigone, or Agamemnon. So, but comedy can still have a purpose and a message. Like if you think about the Seth Rogen movie, The Interview, that movie's making pretty sharp political commentary, even though it's incredibly crude and funny. So, how might comedy be useful in that sense? And what do you expect to see here if you haven't read it yet, that, you didn't see in tragedy? Like laughter would be an example. Some answers might be obvious, but I think just thinking the question through is a good exercise. So a little bit about Aristophanes. We don't know as much about him as we do Aeschylus or Sophocles, but he is the only comic poet from ancient Athens whose writing has survived. Remember, there are only 4 whose manuscripts have not been lost. And so we read Sophocles and we read Aeschylus, and to not overburden you with too much reading, we're not reading Euripides, but those 3 were all tragedians. Aristophanes was the only comedic writer. There were plenty of others we know from our records. We even know some of their names and some of the names of their works, but we don't actually have the manuscript. So he's the only comic poet whose writing has survived from that time. He was personally acquainted with the leading writers, thinkers, and politicians of the day, so he knew, a lot of famous people would be another way of putting that, whom he satirized in his plays. So another way of saying this would be he knew most of the famous people of the day, and he made fun of them in his plays. Which you even see some of that here, where the lady had the sign up about Cleon. He was the leader at the time who supported the war, and Aristophanes knew him, but he still made fun of him in the play. He did not win at the Great Dionysia like Aeschylus, but there were other dramatic competitions. The Greeks in ancient Athens in this century, they loved their drama, and so they had all kinds of competitions. Even though he didn't win the Great Dionysia, he won other ones. That's all we really know about Aristophanes biographically. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Peloponnesian War, which lasted a long time, almost 30 years, and it was a civil war between the Spartan and Athenian empires. So those were Greek city-states, but they were both powerful empires of their own, and they wanted to be the most superior Greek state, so they fought each other. And a lot of Greeks thought, like the ladies in this play, thought that fighting was foolish. I'll go into more detail on that on the next slide, but a little bit about the play itself before we move on. It combines basic humor, so there's a lot of very crude sex jokes here, like a lot. And a lot of them are really funny. I mean, I was laughing out loud when I read this to prepare for class. But it also has sharp political and social satire. So it's not just crude and funny, it's also really clever. And you see that with the title character, Lysistrata. The moments with her are usually the sharp political moments, and the moments with the other characters are usually the ones with the more base kind of humor. And so that is the first example in a series of examples I'll bring up that show an important trend in the text, which is that Lysistrata is very unique and set apart from her other female companions, her peers, the other female characters. She's very different from them. And in one way she's very different from them is she's got this political satire but very intelligent aspect of her personality, whereas the humor with the other female characters is a more base, kind of crude sexual humor. Aristophanes' plays in general, not just this one, satirize both revolutionary and traditional ideas. So a lot of people think of Aristophanes as a traditionalist, kind of a conservative, like a lot of the more revolutionary ideas he critiqued and made fun of, but he invented his own style of playwriting, and was the most influential, comedy playwright for centuries. So he was a revolutionist in his own way, if not in his ideas, then in his writing. And one of the most important questions we'll ask is this just funny? Is this just entertainment? Or is it a literary masterpiece? We don't know what his goal was. He seems to be making a point about the war, and he seems to be kind of making a point about gender roles, but then he often undermines those things, and there's no clear-cut answer, which means this is a very complex work, and that's important to giving it literary value, but we don't know what his goal was. I think there's enough here you can make the argument that this is a sharp political satire and he wanted to create change. But every time he seems to do that, he undermines it. And there's so much crude, crass-based humor, he may have just been trying to make people laugh and using the war as subject matter, taking it and using it just to make people laugh. Like, come back to that movie, The Interview. If you've ever seen it, it's about 5 years old. It's really funny. It's about North Korea with Seth Rogen and James Franco. I think it's a great comparison because it's incredibly funny. But there is kind of a political message. But you have to ask, do the writers, the authors, the actors, do they really care about this political message? Or did they just see the subject matter and think this would be really funny? And like I said, some scholars are more skeptical, and you might not expect to study a work like this in a class like this. So I think, a question we have to ask is this a masterpiece? Is this great literature that you should study in school? And like I said, we'll come back to this question as well as the related question of kind of the divide between Lysistrata and the other female characters. We'll come back to both of those all throughout the lecture and on the discussion board, because those are the two questions that drive our study of this text, is the difference between Lysistrata and the other females, and then is this political satire, or is it just comedic entertainment. So think about both of those as we march forth. Reading questions. Of course, what do you think of Lysistrata as a protagonist? I mean, after Antigone and Clytemnestra, we have not just a lot of examples of female characters like we did in Gilgamesh and the Odyssey in the Bible, but female main characters, protagonists. And I mean, this is comedy, so there's going to be some differences, but it's nice to see a female character who's not, it's not about to end horribly for her like it does for Antigone and Clytemnestra. This text has a happy ending. So, and obviously she's incredibly intelligent, and maybe in moral and whatnot, maybe to an unrealistic level. Is she a human character? Can you relate to her? Or is she more of an ideal, embodying the author's virtues and values more so than a human, flawed character like Antigone? So these are some things to think through that we'll continue to come back to. And then this is kind of a repeat of the recall question. But like I said, this play, I've said it a lot of times, too many. This play has a lot in common with the comedy films you and I and others probably enjoy today. So how is Aristophanes maybe using some of those comedic devices here? Like if he is, let's say hypothetically, he does want to make a political point. How is he using crude sex humor to do that? Like, if it's not one or the other, what's the relationship between the two, would be another way to put it. Continue to think about these things. We're going to do close reading in just a second. But on the first half of this slide, I'm going to go over the Peloponnesian War in a little more detail for you. So this play was first performed in 411 BC, just 2 years after the Athenian fleet had been destroyed in the Sicily expedition of 413. So remember, the war, we're going the opposite direction, counting down instead of up with each century because we're doing BC rather than AD. And so the war lasted from 431 to 404, so 27 years. And it ended in 404. 413 was a pivotal year. If you look up more about this war, if you Google online more about it than our textbook covered, you'll see there was like 3 phases to the war. And the loss of the Sicily expedition in 413 set off the last 9 years of the war. And that last decade of the war is really Athens losing the war. And Athens eventually loses. And until this point, they were the biggest Greek empire. They were the most powerful city-state. This text dovetails well with Agamemnon, because in studying Aeschylus, we saw how that sense of democracy and communal spirit and pride led to Athens rising to power. Aristophanes is a little bit younger than Aeschylus. So here we saw the rise of Athens with Aeschylus. Here we see the fall of Athens with Aristophanes, and how they eventually lose this war, and they never really regain their prominence. After this, Sparta becomes the most powerful Greek city-state. And so, I mean, in some respects, hindsight's 2020. It's not really fair for us to look back, but we can look back and say maybe if they'd pulled out of the war, maybe it would have gone better or differently. Maybe Aristophanes had a point here. But let's go ahead and look now with that background and context covered. Let's go ahead and look at the play. So my first question is, what are the different ways we're going to present it in the play? So I said Lysistrata is presented very differently by Aristophanes than her counterparts, and that's key to understanding the play. So how is she presented differently? Like, what specifically do I mean? Let's look at a quick interaction from early on in the play, lines 8 through 11 from the prologue. She said, "But my heart's on fire, Colonike, and I'm terribly annoyed about us women. According to the men, we're capable of all sorts of mischief. And that we are by Zeus," says Colonike. So that Nike, like the company, that is a Greek word. Basically what Lysistrata is saying here is that there are all kinds of horrible stereotypes about us. Men think we're like mischievous and deceptive and hedonistic, and Colonike says, and we are. So Lysistrata is trying to question the stereotype. She's trying to say, this bothers me. My heart's on fire about it. Today, if we were translating that less literally and translating it in today's English, we would say, she would say, I'm salty about this, is what she would say. And so Lysistrata is trying to say, these stereotypes about women bother me. And let's do something about it. Let's show them that we're more than this. And her friend Paula Nike says, we're not. That's what we are. They're right. By Zeus, which is the highest name, most important name you can invoke in ancient Greece. So basically what you have is a lot of negative stereotypes about women appear in this play. Like I said, that they're mischievous, deceitful, hedonistic. And Lysistrata is not that way. She's virtuous, she's intelligent, and she challenges the presentation of her character critiques those stereotypes. But you turn around 2 seconds later, all the other female characters are acting out the stereotypes and supporting that view. And so it's really hard. You have to ask, which view does the author hold? Lysistrata challenges the stereotypes. Literally all of the other female characters just reinforce them. So which view is Aristophanes taking? It's a great question. There's no right or wrong answer. And he could go either way. If you want to make the argument that he's challenging gender stereotypes, there's textual evidence to support that with Lysistrata. If you want to make the argument he's reinforcing them, there's evidence to support that with all the other female characters. And you may say Lysistrata is just one character, but she's the most important character. The play is named for her. So it can really go either way. And I'll definitely ask for your thoughts on this on the discussion board, but I hope this example, this quote, really kind of frames that question or that issue for you so you understand what I'm asking there and can kind of look throughout the play and see. Next, I ask, what is the main point that Lysistrata makes in her argument? So like I said, Aristophanes is putting forth a really important question or idea, a challenge, if you will, a political point about the war and about gender roles, and he sees the two as connected. The war and gender roles are connected. And it's a question, is he serious or is he just using that for content, for humor? And just like the other question, it can go either way. But there's a part in the middle. It's one of the most famous scenes where Lysistrata interacts with the magistrate, and she really articulates that position well. And so if we're going to ask this question of, is the play partially serious or not at all, we have to say, if it's serious, what is its main message? And the main message comes through in this scene I'm about to read. So it's a back and forth between Lysistrata and the magistrate. The magistrate asks, so how will you women be able to put a stop to such a complicated international mess and sort it all out? Very easily. How? Show me. Lysistrata uses the contents of the basket which the magistrate was given to illustrate her demonstration. It's rather like a ball of yarn. When it gets tangled up, we hold it this way and carefully wind out the strands on our spindles. Now this way, now that way. That's how we'll wind up this war, if allowed. Unsnarling it by sending embassies, now this way, now that way. So what she's really saying here is that the type of skill women have learned in the narrow gender roles, such as the patient management of details, is precisely as what is missing from the masculine headlong pursuit of war. So Greece was known as a warlike empire, and that the two concepts, it almost is inherent, right? Empire and warlike. But it became even more so after the Peloponnesian War, because Sparta was a much more warlike state than Athens. And once Sparta became the most prominent one, Greece, advanced on even more military campaigns. And so, the men fought in the wars. Women weren't allowed to serve as soldiers. And there became this idea that war was like a masculine thing, or at least that's the idea Aristophanes is presenting here. And again, I think it's ambiguous as to whether he's believes that idea or if he's just introducing it and then making fun of it. And I want to hear what you think of that, or read what you think of that. But what he's saying here is if war is a masculine thing, like we've seen in Greek society and like people have claimed, then if war is a problem, how do we fix it? Then maybe taking a female perspective and mapping that onto war might help. And so in this society where women are very limited in what they can do, they can't serve in the military, they can't vote, the things they're supposed to do, like knit, in this Greek society, maybe there's some things they learned from that, some skills. In a society where gender roles are so rigid, men and women are going to learn different skills because they're doing different things. So she's saying maybe we take some of what women know and apply it over here. And the textbook uses the phrase patient management of details I've borrowed as just one example of a type of skill women would have learned. And it really is embodied by that phrase, unsnarling it by sending emissaries. Lysistrata is using a yarn ball as kind of a metaphor for war. It's a big jumbled mess. Maybe men don't have the attention to detail to unsnarl that mess. Maybe women do. Maybe we can know how to deploy the emissaries so that they can negotiate the treaties. It's a really, really interesting idea. It's interesting enough that I'm tempted to say Aristophanes is trying to make a point here. But then you turn around and you have these ridiculous scenes between all the other men and women that are incredibly funny, but very stereotypical. And so, it's a tough play to get a read on. It's a tough play to get a beat on. Comedy can often be subversive in that way, but it gives us one way or another a lot of really interesting things to think about. All right, so I hope you enjoyed the comedy of this play. I didn't do a plot summary because plot's not really important in a comedy. But I hope the ideas have been clear from this lecture and that you enjoyed reading something quite different from everything else we've read so far. So here's some things to think about for the discussion board. The first one is that Lysistrata question. She's clever, intelligent, eloquent, articulate, but the other female characters are like hedonistic and manipulative. So one thing that's happened with the staging of this play, because plays are performed, and so Aristophanes wrote it, but people still put on this play today. So a lot of modern directors stage it as like a feminist play, and really emphasize Lysistrata in the kind of the things I just mentioned on the last slide. And so some scholars see this as a proto-feminist play, like an example of feminism before that term was used. But do you think that's right for them to do it that way? Some scholars say, look at this. It's full of crass humor and stereotypes. This is just good, not clean fun, but good fun, good humor. And so you can't be arguing that it's feminism when you have so many hedonistic and manipulative women, even if the main character, she's the main character, but she's different, but still all compare with all these other characters. So where do you land on this debate I've been talking about the whole lecture? I really am curious to see. The textbook brings up an interesting idea I think would be interesting to explore. That the play basically makes a connection between imperialism or territorial expansion, one country going into another country and violently taking it over. The textbook argues that this play argues that sexuality can be a substitute for that. Maybe men or people are conquering other countries because they're not having sex, and vice versa. If they're having sex, they don't need to do that. So do you think this is a serious idea? from Aristophanes. And then two, part B of the question, it's a two-part question. Do you agree with this idea or not? And no right or wrong answer. I'm just plain curious. It's an idea that hadn't occurred to me till I was preparing to teach this play, but now it's really fascinating to me, and I don't know honestly don't know how I'd answer it. So I'm just curious, what you think. But there's other things to choose from here. And now that this claim from the textbook comes from a scene at the end of the play where Lysistrata puts this like gorgeous woman in front of the men, and they've all been deprived of sex for so long that like they'll do anything to end the sex strike. And so they're like, sign here, you can have this territory, the war will end. But the name of this woman she puts in front of them when they're like, it's really getting to them that they haven't had sex in so long. The name of this woman is Reconciliation. And so that's kind of, that anecdote is part of how the editors of the textbook came up with this claim about the link between sex and imperialism. But what I think is really important from that scene is that character is named Reconciliation. Because if I were to pick one word to sum up this play, and that word was not sex, it would be reconciliation, right? It's a civil war. And Athens ends up falling, losing its empire because they fought with Sparta till they lost. So how is reconciliation important? Like, if we had a list of themes for this play, like we had with Agamemnon, where we listed vengeance, justice, law, etc., like reconciliation would be at the top and highlighted. So you could also talk about reconciliation, how it's important, how it plays out in the play. That's question number 3. Final question you can choose from, the one I've been asking the whole time. Is he trying to entertain people, or is he trying to make political change? Does he really think the war should end? The real war the play is based on, that was happening at the time it was performed, that led to the downfall of Athens 8 years later? Or is he just saying, subject matter of the day, people will understand this, they'll relate to it, it could be really funny, and then deliver something truly funny? And I didn't quite say this here, but you can also get into with this question, is this a masterpiece? Is this a great work of literature that should be taught in classes like this? Or is it more just kind of an entertaining piece that gives us some insight of the time period it comes from, which is important, but doesn't necessarily mean it's great literature? So a lot to think about. I hope you enjoyed the humor.